The courthouse stood as a gray sentinel at the heart of downtown Springfield, Illinois, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of hurried feet and late arrivals. That morning, the sun slanted through the tall windows of the main courtroom, casting long, solemn shadows across the polished wooden benches. Inside, a murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of curiosity, grief, and a quiet anger that seemed to settle like dust over every surface. Reporters pressed against the railing with their cameras and microphones, chasing every angle, every expression. They had arrived hours early, some to secure seats, others to stake claims to the best vantage points for capturing the story of the day, the trial of Officer Daniel Rourke, a police officer charged with actions that had ended in tragedy. It was not just any trial. It had already garnered national attention. The case had begun with the worst kind of headlines: a botched drug raid, a young mother dead, and a toddler left behind. The media had sensationalized the story, painting Rourke alternately as villain and scapegoat. But inside this courtroom, the sharp edges of narrative softened, and human complexity came into full view. This was no longer a headline. It was a story of lives, lives that intertwined in ways no one had fully grasped until now. Among the attendees sat one man, quiet and reserved, his presence largely unnoticed in the sea of flashing cameras and scribbling reporters. Michael Carson, the widower of the young mother who had died that fateful night, held a small bundle in his arms. His 3-year-old daughter, Emily, clutched a frayed stuffed bunny to her chest, her wide brown eyes reflecting the sunlight streaming through the windows. Emily's hair fell in soft waves around her round cheeks, and though she was too young to understand the words spoken around her, she could feel the tension, as if it were a living thing pressing against her small body. Michael adjusted his daughter in his lap, whispering softly to reassure her, though he was scarcely reassuring himself. He had spent the last months in a haze of grief, anger, and sleepless nights, navigating life as a single parent while grappling with a loss that felt too immense to name. Now, sitting here in a room filled with strangers and the ghosts of his wife, he felt an unfamiliar mixture of anticipation and dread. He had expected grief, yes, but also something else, the sharp, unfamiliar weight of hope. The gallery was slowly filling with other members of the public, journalists, and legal observers. Some were there for justice, some for spectacle. A few local residents whispered among themselves, exchanging theories and recollections, eager to grasp any morsel of insight into a case that had shocked their community. The air smelled faintly of old wood and polish, mixed with the faint metallic tang of nervous energy. Reporters clicked pens, adjusted microphones, and flipped open laptops. Cameras focused on Rourke, whose expression remained unreadable, a mask of disciplined calm belying the storm behind his eyes. Officer Daniel Rourke stood at the defense table, his uniform pressed and neat, hands resting lightly on the surface before him. He had been trained for high-pressure situations, for moments when split-second decisions could mean life or death. Yet nothing in his training had prepared him for the weight of this trial. Months of internal investigations and public scrutiny had stripped away his confidence in ways that no amount of repetition or procedure could restore. His gaze occasionally flicked toward Michael and Emily, the tangible reminders of the consequences of that night, and a flash of something unspoken passed between them, a mixture of recognition, guilt, and raw human vulnerability. The judge entered, her robe swishing softly across the floor, commanding immediate attention. Judge Helena Crawford was known for her meticulous fairness and her unwavering focus on justice, qualities that would be put to the ultimate test in this courtroom. She carried an air of quiet authority, and her eyes, sharp and assessing, took in the room at a glance. With a firm rap of the gavel, she called the session to order, and the room fell into a silence so deep it felt almost tangible. It was in that hush, amidst the scent of polished wood and human tension, that the first notes of what would become a remarkable story began to resonate. As the proceedings began, Emily's attention wandered. She was too young to follow the complex legal arguments, but she was acutely aware of the emotional undertones that saturated the room. She noticed the hurried whispers, the furtive glances, and the stiffness of her father's posture. Her small hand clutched the bunny tighter. Her gaze drifted toward a shadow at the doorway, a large figure stepping into the courtroom. It was not human. It was a police dog, walking with measured, deliberate steps. The German shepherd's coat glimmered in the sunlight, and there was a calmness to its demeanor that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. The bailiff escorted the dog slowly, ensuring it moved between the aisles without disruption. Cameras swiveled, journalists murmured, and even some spectators held their breath. Emily's eyes widened, and a soft, involuntary sound escaped her lips. "Doggy." Her father instinctively shushed her, but the girl's attention did not waver. She was captivated. The dog, named Max, paused for a moment, sniffing the air as if acknowledging her presence. There was a quiet understanding in that gesture, a connection unspoken and unexpected. Michael noticed it, too, and his throat tightened. He had not anticipated this reaction, this quiet bond forming between his daughter and a retired police dog. Something about the dog's presence felt familiar, almost as though it were linked to memories too painful, yet too essential to ignore. He tried to focus on the trial, on the words of lawyers and witnesses, but Emily's quiet fascination pulled at him. The tension in the room seemed to bend, subtly shifting focus from the grim subject of the trial to something more human, more intimate, and more inexplicably profound. The spectators felt it too. The dog's measured steps across the floor, the soft tap of nails against the polished wood, and Emily's tiny outstretched hand created a scene that was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. There was a strange pause in the hum of human voices, a suspension of disbelief and expectation. Something was about to unfold, and although no one yet knew exactly what, every person in that room felt the quiet anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks or a secret is finally revealed. And in that first part of the trial, with sunlight streaming through the windows and shadows dancing on the floor, the stage was set for a story that would go beyond law, procedure, and media spectacle. It was a story of memory, recognition, and the subtle, sometimes overlooked ways in which truth has a way of finding its voice, even through the innocent eyes of a 3-year-old child. The courtroom, now fully seated, carried an almost unbearable weight of expectation. Judge Helena Crawford's gavel struck the desk with a firm, echoing rap, signaling the start of testimony. Michael Carson tightened his grip on Emily, whose tiny fingers were intertwined with his own, and took a slow, steadying breath. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, and every murmur, every shuffle of paper seemed amplified in the hushed room. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. Everyone inside the courtroom was acutely aware that the events of that night had left scars, both visible and invisible, that could not easily be repaired. The prosecution called the first witness, Detective Laura Fields, a tall woman with an unyielding presence and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had been on the scene during the raid and carried a notebook filled with painstakingly recorded details. Her voice, calm yet firm, cut through the silence as she described the chaotic scene outside the small apartment. Flashing lights, shouting officers, and panicked residents painted a picture of confusion. She spoke of a room littered with overturned furniture, the air thick with smoke and fear. Michael's stomach knotted with every word, his mind conjuring images of Sarah, his wife, caught in that chaos. Next came Officer Tim Reynolds, a colleague of Rourke, whose testimony offered a different perspective. Reynolds explained the rationale behind the rapid entry, describing the procedural urgency and the fear of armed suspects. He spoke of split-second decisions, of training that demanded action even under uncertainty. His words were measured, almost rehearsed, yet the tension in his voice betrayed a trace of doubt, a crack in the carefully maintained veneer of authority. Emily, sitting on her father's lap, tilted her head slightly, sensing the tension in the adults' voices, even if she could not grasp their meaning. As witnesses gave their accounts, the courtroom felt suspended in time. Each testimony layered new details on the narrative, adding complexity to a story that had already captivated the nation. The prosecution emphasized recklessness and deviation from protocol, while the defense highlighted adherence to procedure and the split-second nature of life-or-death decision-making. Michael watched, torn between rage and the desperate hope that truth would prevail. The air was charged with conflicting emotions, every word from the witnesses tugging at the invisible threads of grief, anger, and accountability that bound the room together. In the midst of this, Emily's attention wandered. Too young to understand legal arguments, she instead observed the people around her, noticing subtle shifts in posture, facial expressions, and tone. Her gaze flitted repeatedly toward the side door, anticipating the entrance of the retired police dog. Max, Michael tried to redirect her attention, whispering about the papers and the lawyers, but Emily remained fixed on the doorway, her small body radiating a quiet focus that seemed to command attention even in the crowded room. The next witness, Sarah Jennings, a neighbor who had been outside during the raid, recounted her own experience of the chaos. She described hearing a commotion in the hallway, the rapid footsteps of officers, and the terrified screams of a woman whose voice would haunt Michael for months afterward. Her testimony was vivid and personal, forcing the courtroom to confront the human cost of the operation. Michael could feel Emily shift against him, her head resting on his shoulder, as though sensing the gravity of the words. The juxtaposition of her innocence and the horror being described created a surreal tension that hung in the air like a physical presence. As the testimonies unfolded, it became clear that Max's presence was more than a procedural formality. The dog, now stationed calmly at the side of the courtroom, moved with deliberate grace, his ears occasionally flicking toward voices that carried emotion or tension. Max had once served as a canine officer, trained to detect danger and respond to commands with unwavering precision. Now retired, he seemed almost contemplative, aware in a way that transcended his canine instincts. Emily's eyes never left him, and for the first time, the spectators noticed the quiet but undeniable connection forming between child and dog. Then came the most pivotal moment before the child spoke. The prosecutor, Eleanor Pierce, laid out a timeline of the raid, tracing Officer Rourke's movements step by step. She highlighted moments where hesitation could have prevented tragedy, and moments where protocol conflicted with human instinct. Michael felt his hands tighten around Emily, imagining the choices he would have made in Rourke's position. He struggled to reconcile his grief with the rational explanations unfolding before him, recognizing the stark reality that life-or-death decisions were rarely black and white. The defense attorney, Martin Langley, countered by emphasizing Rourke's years of training and his attempts to protect the officers under his command. He described the stress, fear, and split-second judgment required in raids like this, painting a picture of a man burdened with responsibility, yet trying to do his duty. Langley's words were carefully chosen to humanize Rourke without diminishing the tragedy, highlighting the moral and emotional tightrope walked by law enforcement officers every day. Michael's mind oscillated between empathy and anger, feeling the impossible tension between justice and understanding. Throughout all this, Emily's quiet presence became increasingly magnetic. Observers noted the way she sat, eyes wide and unwavering, absorbing the courtroom atmosphere with an intuition beyond her years. Her attention remained fixed on Max, who occasionally glanced toward her as if acknowledging her silent observation. The spectators began to notice the unspoken dialogue forming between child and dog. A subtle but profound interaction that seemed to promise something unexpected, a revelation waiting to be unearthed, though no one could yet articulate what it might be. Finally, the bailiff escorted Max further into the courtroom, allowing the dog to move closer to the center of the room. The audience collectively leaned forward, sensing the significance of the moment even without knowing why. Emily's small hand twitched, reaching out instinctively, and a faint sound escaped her lips, the first indication that the child would play a role far greater than anyone anticipated. Michael's breath caught, and for a split second, the courtroom seemed to pause, time itself suspended. In that pause, the weight of testimony, grief, and anticipation coalesced into a charged silence. In that tense stillness, it became clear that the trial was no longer just about evidence and procedure. It was about human connection, recognition, and memory. The testimonies had provided facts, but the emotional resonance of the events, grief, loss, and a faint glimmer of hope had begun to penetrate even the most hardened observers. And Emily, in her quiet, intuitive way, had begun to serve as the catalyst, drawing attention to something deeper, something profoundly human that would soon change the course of the courtroom drama entirely. By the time the morning session concluded, the courtroom was charged with a new kind of tension. The testimonies had revealed chaos, procedure, fear, and grief, but they had also opened the door to recognition and memory. Everyone present sensed that the story had only just begun to unfold, that the true revelation was yet to come, and that it might arrive from the most unlikely source, a 3-year-old child who saw, understood, and remembered in ways adults could not. The courtroom had settled into a tense rhythm. Witness after witness had given their statements, and though adults tried to process the complex legalities, for Emily, the world was simpler, framed by the people and things that felt familiar. She sat snugly on her father's lap, her small fingers clutching the edge of his coat, while her other hand held tightly to her worn stuffed bunny. A sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating her soft hair and casting tiny shadows across the polished wood floor. Yet despite the warm sunlight, Emily's gaze was fixed elsewhere, drawn irresistibly toward the large German shepherd at the far end of the room. The dog, Max, moved with a calm, deliberate grace. His coat was a rich blend of black and tan, and his deep, expressive eyes scanned the room with quiet intelligence. Though retired from active duty, he retained an aura of authority and awareness that made everyone instinctively step back. Max's presence alone seemed to command respect, a living bridge between law, loyalty, and memory. Emily's small hand twitched toward him, a movement so subtle that most adults wouldn't have noticed it, yet her father, Michael, caught it immediately. He tightened his hold, whispering softly to her, but she did not waver. Emily's focus was magnetic, her attention unwavering, even as the courtroom hummed with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. She had never met Max before, yet something deep within her recognized him. Perhaps it was the shape of his ears, the gentle tilt of his head, or the way he moved with purpose, but without threat. Whatever it was, Emily's instinct was undeniable. Her little voice broke the quiet momentarily, a soft murmur that seemed almost lost amid the formalities. But the dog paused and tilted his head, ears perking slightly, as if responding to her presence. Michael noticed it immediately. There was something almost uncanny about the interaction, something that went beyond the ordinary connection between child and dog. Emily, unaware of her own significance in this unfolding story, felt a sense of calm wash over her when she looked at Max. Her small body relaxed, the tension in her shoulders easing as she watched him. She was drawn to him with a clarity and certainty that made Michael's chest tighten. How could a 3-year-old know something so instinctively, something that adults could not yet see? The adults in the courtroom were beginning to notice too. A few reporters shifted their attention from the lawyers and witnesses to Emily and Max, sensing that something extraordinary was occurring. A dog's presence, combined with the child's intense focus, created a strange stillness, a moment of human connection that cut through the formalities of the trial. Conversations paused, pens hovered above paper, and eyes subtly tracked the interaction between the small girl and the imposing canine. The courtroom seemed suspended in time, caught between the gravity of the case and the quiet unfolding of a new, unexpected narrative. A bailiff, observing the unusual scene, made sure to maintain order while allowing Max to remain unconfined. The dog moved closer to the center of the room, ears alert, tail low and steady. Emily leaned slightly forward, her eyes wide, the soft grip on her bunny tightening. She whispered, "Doggy," barely audible, yet her voice carried a resonance that seemed to reach Max. He paused, sniffing the air around her, and for a brief, breathless moment, it felt as though the entire room exhaled together. Even the judge's gaze shifted toward the interaction, curiosity mingling with a professional detachment. Michael felt a surge of protective instinct, instinctively holding Emily closer. Yet he could not deny the wonder of the moment. He realized that Emily's focus was not merely childlike curiosity, it was recognition. Something in her young mind, unclouded by legal arguments and adult reasoning, had sensed a connection that no one else could yet articulate. The room had been tense, filled with anger, grief, and anticipation, but Emily's quiet presence, focused entirely on Max, brought a strange sense of clarity and hope. The attorneys, sensing a shift in the room, tried to continue with the procedural aspects of the trial, but the energy had already changed. Witnesses spoke, yet the audience's attention was divided. The press whispered excitedly among themselves, noting the unusual focus of the child. Michael, however, was consumed by both fear and awe. He could feel Emily's intuition guiding him in ways he could not explain, hinting that something significant was about to be revealed. And in truth, he feared and hoped simultaneously. Feared for the tragedy that had already occurred, yet hoped that perhaps this innocent perspective might illuminate truths overlooked by adults. Max, sensing the heightened energy, lowered his head slightly and moved a few steps closer. His paws made soft sounds against the polished floor, each step deliberate and almost ceremonial. Emily's tiny hand extended further, trembling slightly, as though reaching toward something she could not name. Her eyes met Max's, and the dog's steady gaze seemed to acknowledge her recognition. It was not just a child noticing an animal. It was recognition, memory, an instinct converging in a moment that carried weight far beyond the understanding of any adult present. The courtroom was silent, though not formally so. The hum of the city beyond the courthouse windows faded, leaving only the sound of breathing, shuffling papers, and the soft tap of Max's paws. Michael whispered to Emily, "Be gentle, baby," though he knew it was unnecessary. She had no intent to harm, only a profound, unspoken understanding. Even the judge leaned forward slightly in her seat, noting the extraordinary calm that had descended on the room. It was a calm laced with anticipation, a quiet acknowledgement that the ordinary course of events was about to be interrupted by something extraordinary. At that moment, Emily's hand quivered as she finally pointed directly at Max. It was not a hesitant gesture, nor one made from childish curiosity. It was precise, deliberate, and commanding in its own small way. The entire room felt the shift, a subtle energy vibrating in the air. Even the seasoned officers present could sense that something profound was unfolding. Michael's heart raced, a mixture of fear, awe, and anticipation coursing through him. What did she know? What could a child see that so many adults had missed? Max tilted his head, ears twitching in response to the unspoken communication. For the first time, the courtroom felt truly still, as though the normal boundaries of authority, procedure, and expectation had softened. A 3-year-old child had shifted the focus of the room, and everyone present could sense the significance without yet understanding it. Witnesses paused in mid-sentence, attorneys halted their notes, and reporters lowered their cameras slightly, capturing not just a moment, but a human connection that defied explanation. Emily's lips parted, and she whispered 2 words, so soft that at first no one caught them. Mommy's dog. A sound seemed to hang in the air, impossibly fragile, and yet unbearably powerful. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. Michael felt his breath catch in his throat. Max froze, ears alert, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its collective breath. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that rippled through every person present. Recognition, memory, and grief had collided in the innocence of a child's voice, and the courtroom was forever changed in that instant. The judge's gavel remained untouched, the formalities of law suspended by the extraordinary quiet truth emerging before them. Emily had not yet understood the magnitude of her words, but everyone else did. The court had been filled with procedural details, testimonies, and analysis, but it had never encountered this, a raw, unfiltered connection cutting through the tension and chaos, revealing something no witness, no document, and no lawyer could have predicted. For the first time, the courtroom felt human in its entirety, united by awe, grief, and the subtle power of recognition. The courtroom had already been tense, filled with the hum of whispered conversations, the rustle of paper, and the distant tapping of pens. Yet in that moment, everything froze. Emily, her small hand pointing unerringly at Max, finally spoke in a voice so soft it barely carried across the polished wood floor. Mommy's dog. The words were simple, almost childlike, yet they struck the room like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, there was no sound at all. Every adult present, judge, attorneys, witnesses, and spectators alike, froze. Pens hovered mid-air, microphones captured silence instead of testimony, and the usual shuffling of papers stopped completely. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed suspended, as though the building itself had recognized the moment's weight. Michael's hand tightened instinctively around Emily's shoulder. His breath caught in his throat, a sharp, sudden recognition piercing through his grief. He had heard stories of children exhibiting uncanny intuition, of seemingly small, innocent gestures revealing truths adults had overlooked. But he had never experienced it firsthand. Now, looking down at his daughter's wide, innocent eyes, he realized that Emily had just pierced the veil of the tragedy that had consumed their lives. Max, the retired police dog, paused mid-step. His ears twitched, his head tilted slightly, and his gaze locked onto Emily's with a quiet intensity. There was a weight to the way he regarded her, an acknowledgement of her words and presence that no one could explain. The courtroom held its collective breath as the dog remained motionless, seemingly waiting, aware that something profound had just been said. Judge Helena Crawford, known for her composure and meticulous attention to procedure, lowered her gavel slowly. Even she was affected, a flicker of surprise crossing her otherwise stern features. She had presided over thousands of cases, yet she had rarely witnessed a moment so raw, so human, that transcended law, logic, and procedure. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the attorneys, the witnesses, and the crowd, all locked in the same stunned silence. The prosecution team exchanged quick, bewildered glances. Eleanor Pierce, an experienced attorney who had navigated countless high-profile cases, felt her heart skip a beat. She had meticulously built her timeline, pieced together every detail of that fateful night. And yet, here was a 3-year-old, a child, altering the focus of the courtroom in a way that no witness or piece of evidence had managed. She quickly jotted the words in her notebook, though she knew that no amount of transcription could capture their significance. Across the room, Martin Langley, the defense attorney, adjusted his tie and leaned slightly forward, his face a mask of curiosity and caution. He had spent months preparing for every possible angle in the trial, but he had not anticipated this, a revelation so simple, so pure, yet so disruptive. He watched Emily, understanding that the child had just pointed out a connection no adult had yet recognized. It was a detail so subtle that it had gone unnoticed in the endless paperwork, the investigation files, and the police reports. Michael could hardly breathe. The grief that had defined the past months seemed to press harder against his chest, and yet intertwined with it was a strange flicker of hope. Emily had just said something that mattered, something that transcended the sterile details of the case. Her words carried recognition, memory, and perhaps the first step toward understanding what had truly happened that night. And in that recognition, Michael felt a shift, an opening for clarity, truth, and perhaps even justice. The witnesses, who had moments before been recounting the chaotic night with precision and pain, now looked on in disbelief. Detective Lara Fields, the first witness, felt her own breath catch. She had witnessed the raid, studied every report, and testified with careful detail, but she had never noticed this connection. And now a 3-year-old had revealed it in 2 small, powerful words. She glanced at her colleagues, seeing the same mixture of shock and awe mirrored in their eyes. Emily's small voice had caused the room to pause, yet it had also drawn attention to the intricate web of history surrounding the case. Max, the dog, had been a partner in the K-9 unit long before Officer Rourke had assumed responsibility. And that connection, buried deep in reports and personnel records, was now brought to light by the simple observation of a child. The realization began to ripple through the courtroom. Emily's words were not just a statement, but a key, unlocking memories, facts, and truths that no legal argument had yet revealed. The spectators felt the moment's weight. Even those who had arrived seeking sensational headlines could sense that this was something extraordinary. Conversations hushed to a whisper. Reporters lowered their cameras, knowing that the most important part of the story was unfolding not in the carefully rehearsed testimony, but in the interaction between a child and a dog. Parents in the audience exchanged glances, understanding instinctively the rare clarity children could bring, the unfiltered perception that adults often overlooked. Michael's heart pounded. He leaned closer to Emily, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and whispered, "Yes, baby?" That's right. He could hardly believe that his daughter, in her innocence, had observed what the grown-ups could not. He felt both pride and fear. Pride that she could see what he could not, and fear because this recognition carried consequences, unveiling truths he had tried to grapple with privately. Judge Crawford cleared her throat, breaking the frozen moment. "Order in the court," she said softly but firmly, though her voice carried an undertone of awe. The words did little to disturb the stillness. The courtroom had collectively recognized that Emily's observation was more than a simple child's comment. It had become the pivot point of the trial, the moment where procedural detachment met raw human intuition. Officer Rourke, seated at the defense table, visibly stiffened. His eyes flicked toward the child, then to Max, and a faint tremor ran through his otherwise controlled demeanor. In the past, he had relied on procedure, training, and protocol to navigate his duties. Now, confronted by a 3-year-old's recognition, he was forced to confront memories he had carefully compartmentalized, memories of decisions made in a blur of fear, authority, and responsibility. The silence stretched. Emily's eyes never left Max, who had moved just slightly closer, sniffing the air around her, as if acknowledging the weight of her words. It was more than recognition. It was connection. Michael realized that the dog's presence had been essential all along, a living link between past and present, innocence and tragedy, memory and truth. Emily had just reminded everyone of that link, bridging gaps that paperwork and testimony could not. For a moment, the courtroom felt timeless. There was grief, yes, but also awe, curiosity, and a fragile sense of hope. In 2 simple words, Emily had illuminated a connection that adults had overlooked, and in doing so, shifted the focus of the trial in a profound, irrevocable way. Even reporters, poised to capture the spectacle of legal drama, lowered their pens, recognizing that they were witnessing something far greater, a truth spoken not by lawyers, witnesses, or judges, but by the clarity of a child's perspective. Max remained calm, yet fully aware, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that went beyond instinct. The courtroom absorbed the subtle tension, the quiet revelation, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the child's words had opened a door. What had begun as testimony and argument was now human story, raw, intimate, and impossible to ignore. Michael held Emily closer, feeling a mix of awe and apprehension. "You see, baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're showing us something we've missed." Emily looked up at him, her face calm, almost knowing, as if she understood the gravity of her observation without needing the details. The courtroom had shifted, subtly but irreversibly. 2 words, uttered by a 3-year-old, had transformed the entire room, and perhaps the course of justice itself. And as the echoes of Emily's words settled over the room, a new anticipation filled the air. Everyone present sensed that what had been revealed was only the beginning, that the true implications of those 2 words were yet to fully unfold. The trial had moved from a procedural recounting of events to a human story of recognition, grief, and connection. In that moment, the courtroom became more than a room of judgment. It became a stage for a truth that could not be ignored, a truth that would soon reshape everyone's understanding of that fateful night. The courtroom had quieted in a way that made every small sound, a cough, a pen tapping, even the soft shuffle of feet, feel magnified. Emily's 2 words, "Mommy's dog," lingered in the air, creating a tension that seemed to stretch every second into a lifetime. Attorneys, witnesses, and spectators alike exchanged glances, a mixture of confusion and awe mirrored in every face. The room had shifted from procedural observation to something far more human. An unspoken understanding that a truth previously hidden had begun to emerge. Michael Carson, gripping Emily gently on his lap, could hardly believe what had just occurred. His daughter's recognition of Max had somehow pulled something from the depths of memory and official record that no adult had yet uncovered. He looked down at her, wide-eyed, as though searching for some explanation in the small, innocent face turned toward the large, calm dog. "You see, baby," he whispered, though his voice shook with emotion, "you're telling us something important." Emily's gaze remained fixed, her fingers curling slightly into the stuffed bunny she always carried. The judge, Helena Crawford, signaled for a brief recess, giving the attorneys and witnesses a moment to process what had just happened. The bailiff discreetly allowed Max to remain in the room, his calm presence now seeming even more significant. Reporters leaned toward one another, murmuring about the unprecedented nature of the moment, their attention no longer on testimony, but on the connection unfolding before them. Emily had revealed something beyond procedure, beyond the law, something raw, intuitive, and unmistakably true. Attorney Eleanor Pierce, representing the prosecution, leaned forward, flipping through the case files she had studied for months. Her eyes widened as she realized that the seemingly innocuous presence of the retired K-9, Max, was tied to the original investigation in ways no one had fully understood. She whispered urgently to her colleagues, "Look at his service record. He was assigned to Sarah Carson before the raid. This could explain everything." Pierce's fingers trembled as she traced dates and assignments, a pattern emerging that had been buried deep within personnel files and overlooked reports. Martin Langley, the defense attorney, adjusted his glasses and peered down at his own notes. He recognized the significance immediately. "Max," he muttered under his breath, "this changes context entirely." The dog had once partnered with Sarah Carson, Emily's late mother, as part of her K-9 unit duties. Max had been trained to follow her commands, respond to her presence, and trust only her guidance in critical situations. That bond, forged over years of training and shared experiences, had remained in Max's instincts long after Sarah's retirement. And now, in an almost miraculous alignment of timing, Emily had identified that bond with the innocence only a child could possess. The courtroom staff quickly pieced together the missing link. Sarah Carson, a former K-9 officer, had left the mice, forced to raise her daughter, but had remained connected to Max in limited capacity through training and occasional visits. The raid conducted on the night of her death had occurred at an address tied to one of her previous investigations, a detail that had gone unnoticed in the flurry of paperwork, departmental transfers, and routine operational procedures. Max's presence in the courtroom, his calm but alert demeanor, now carried a deeper meaning. He was more than a retired police dog. He was a living link to Sarah Carson, a silent witness to the chaos that had ended her life prematurely. Michael's mind raced as the implications unfolded. Every detail suddenly fit together in ways he had never considered. Emily's instinctive recognition had drawn attention to a thread no adult had followed, no matter how meticulous the investigation. The realization hit him with a combination of awe and sorrow. The raid had not just been a procedural failure. It had intersected with the life and work of someone they had loved, someone whose memory now guided a small child's insight. His heart ached for the cruel irony, yet he felt a flicker of relief that the truth was now beginning to surface. The witnesses on the stand, hearing the renewed examination of Max's history, began to provide additional context. Detective Laura Fields, who had observed the raid firsthand, recounted how the information provided that night had been incomplete, a fragmentary timeline that failed to account for Sarah Carson's prior involvement. Officer Tim Reynolds elaborated on the confusion in communication between units, emphasizing how easily a misstep could occur. And throughout it all, Max remained calm, his presence quietly affirming the connection Emily had pointed out. The dog had become an unexpected witness to the story of human error, memory, and recognition, bridging gaps no words could describe. Judge Crawford's expression softened slightly as the layers of revelation emerged. She understood the weight of Emily's observation, that a 3-year-old had unveiled a truth obscured by time, bureaucracy, and grief. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, noting the astonishment on the faces of attorneys, witnesses, and spectators. A judge's gavel rested idle. The formalities of law had given way to the power of memory and instinct. In that silence, she recognized that this case, though grounded in procedural justice, had transformed into a story of human connection, grief and revelation that no legal manual could have anticipated. Michael watched Emily carefully, marveling at the clarity of her small, innocent observation. She had no understanding of the complexities of the trial, yet she had recognized something adults had overlooked for months. He felt pride mixed with a piercing awareness of the fragility of life and the inexplicable ways in which the world sometimes reveals truth. The moment was intensely personal, yet universally affecting. It was a quiet reminder that insight and recognition often transcend formal expertise. The courtroom staff, the press, and even casual observers began to murmur, recounting Emily's words and the remarkable presence of Max. The child's recognition had shifted the energy of the room, creating a bridge between past and present, loss and understanding. Attorneys began revising their strategies, not yet knowing how this revelation would affect the case, but fully aware that a new pivotal fact had emerged. Emily's words had exposed a connection no one had anticipated, a living link to the victim, and her work that had quietly endured, waiting to be acknowledged. Emily's gaze never left Max, and the dog's calm response seemed to affirm the depth of her recognition. The courtroom felt charged with emotion, a blend of sorrow, revelation, and a faint glimmer of hope. Michael felt tears prickle at the corners of his eyes, realizing that his daughter, in her innocence, had brought clarity to a tragedy that had seemed insurmountable. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound truths are revealed not through meticulous analysis or careful planning, but through instinct, memory, and the unfiltered perception of a child. As the proceedings resumed, Judge Crawford allowed for additional testimony to clarify Max's connection to Sarah Carson. Documentation was reviewed, service records examined, and witness statements corroborated the unexpected link. Each revelation deepened the courtroom's understanding of the tragic events, casting new light on decisions made and paths taken. Emily's observation had become a catalyst, unlocking a chain of understanding that had remained buried until now. By the end of the session, it was undeniable. Emily had changed the course of the trial. 2 simple words had unveiled connections, memories, and truths that no adult had pieced together. Max had been the bridge, and Emily, the smallest but most perceptive participant, had identified it. The courtroom was left in awe of the child's intuition and the living testimony of the dog, recognizing that in moments of grief and tragedy, clarity often comes from the most unexpected places. And as Michael held Emily close, feeling her soft breath against his chest, he understood the magnitude of her simple, yet profound recognition. In her innocence, she had not just pointed to Max. She had illuminated a deeper truth, one that would resonate through the rest of the trial and forever alter the way they understood that fateful night. For the first time since the tragedy, Michael felt the faint stirrings of hope that understanding and acknowledgement could bring a measure of peace. Officer Daniel Rourke had spent months maintaining a facade of composure. Months of legal preparation, media scrutiny, and internal reflection had hardened him, or at least he had convinced himself that it had. Yet, as the courtroom settled after Emily's quiet but monumental declaration, that facade began to crack. The 2 words, "Mommy's dog," had unleashed a tidal wave of recognition, memory, and unspoken guilt, exposing the emotional core of a tragedy he had long tried to rationalize. Rourke sat stiffly at the defense table, hands clasped tightly in front of him. His eyes, usually focused and unyielding, now flickered between Emily, her father, and Max. The quiet intensity of the child's observation unsettled him in a way nothing else had. For the first time, he saw not just the consequences of his actions, but the human faces behind the case. The small girl's recognition of Max was more than an innocent comment. It was a mirror, reflecting the chain of decisions that had led to an unthinkable outcome. He tried to focus on the procedural details he had memorized, on the legal arguments he had rehearsed countless times, but they now seemed hollow. The room was not listening for technicalities. It was listening for truth, for acknowledgement, for a moment of humanity. And in that charged silence, Rourke could no longer hide behind the carefully constructed walls of professional detachment. He swallowed hard, trying to summon the words, but they caught in his throat, thick with emotion. Michael Carson, sitting across the courtroom, observed the change. He had spent months wondering whether Rourke was capable of genuine remorse, whether justice could ever encompass the loss of Sarah. Now, he saw the officer's body tense, shoulders shaking subtly, eyes glistening. Michael's chest tightened, an involuntary response to the raw vulnerability emerging before him. Emily, unaware of the weight of her role, leaned against him, still focused on Max, her small hand gently patting the dog's head. The innocence of the child contrasted sharply with the emotional storm unfolding at the defense table. Rourke finally spoke, his voice quivering despite the attempt at control. I recognized the address that night, he admitted, barely above a whisper. I knew the intel came from a case Sarah Carson had worked on, and I pressed on anyway. His words hung in the air, heavy with guilt. The courtroom, previously tense with curiosity and anticipation, absorbed the confession with a stillness that was almost tangible. Witnesses paused, attorneys leaned forward, and the judge's eyes softened as she realized the depth of Rourke's emotional unraveling. He continued, each word a struggle between explanation and confession. I followed protocol. I thought I was doing my duty. But I see now. I should have paused. I should have done more. The sentences broke off into ragged breaths, the weight of unspoken regret filling the room. For months, he had compartmentalized the night, reducing decisions to procedures and procedures to actions, but now the human cost was undeniable. Each word he spoke seemed to echo off the polished wood walls, a reminder that no protocol could mitigate grief. Emily's soft murmur to Max continued, yet she remained unaware of the magnitude of what was unfolding. Her simple presence, a constant reminder of life continuing amid tragedy, seemed to amplify Rourke's emotional vulnerability. The courtroom was now witnessing not just testimony, but a rare, human moment. A man confronting the consequences of his actions without pretense, guided unexpectedly by the unfiltered truth of a child's observation. Michael felt a complicated mix of emotions, anger, grief, and an odd sense of empathy. He had not expected this level of vulnerability from the officer responsible for Sarah's death. Yet, witnessing Rourke's breakdown, he understood the paradox of human error and the fragile line between duty and disaster. The courtroom's collective attention had shifted from procedural debate to the raw reality of accountability, and Michael could feel the weight of that shared understanding pressing down on everyone present. The judge, Helena Crawford, maintained her professional demeanor, but allowed the moment to unfold. She understood that legal outcomes were only part of the story. The human acknowledgement of wrongdoing and grief carried its own significance. She did not interrupt, did not demand composure, instead allowing Rourke to articulate the remorse that had long been suppressed. Every word, every tremor in his voice was a testament to the emotional complexity of the case, a narrative no file, report, or witness testimony had fully captured. Witnesses in the courtroom watched intently. Detective Lavra Fields, who had meticulously documented every action during the raid, felt a chill run down her spine. She had observed the night with professional detachment, yet Rourke's confession humanized the procedural notes she had filed. Officer Tim Reynolds, usually reserved and stoic, lowered his gaze, suddenly aware of the weight of split-second decisions. Even the most seasoned courtroom veterans recognized that this was more than a breakdown. It was a reckoning. Rourke's voice cracked again as he described the moments leading to the fatal decision. I froze. I acted too quickly. I didn't consider the full context, and now I carry it with me every day. His hands shook as he rested them on the table, fingers clutching at the edges as if trying to anchor himself. The courtroom's silence became almost reverent, the human story unfolding far more powerful than any legal argument could be. Michael felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. But they were not only for Sarah. They were for the collective human struggle he was witnessing, a man confronting his mistakes, a child unknowingly guiding truth to light, and a courtroom transformed from a space of law into a space of recognition, empathy, and grief. He held Emily tighter, feeling the fragility of life and the resilience of memory converge in the same room. Max, still calm, moved closer to Emily, resting his head lightly against her small lap. The dog's presence seemed to stabilize the emotional storm, a quiet counterbalance to the intensity of Rourke's admission. Emily patted him gently, her soft touch a reminder that life, love, and innocence endure even amid tragedy. The bond between child and dog had, in its quiet way, guided the courtroom toward an emotional truth no amount of testimony could replicate. Rourke's confession continued, each word peeling back the layers of denial and rationalization he had relied upon for months. "I thought I was protecting everyone," he said, voice breaking, "but I failed, and it cost a life that I cannot replace." His eyes met Michael's briefly, filled with a raw human apology that transcended the formalities of court. The silent acknowledgement spoke volumes, a rare moment of understanding, bridging the gap between victim and perpetrator, grief and remorse. The courtroom's energy shifted. What had been tension and anticipation now became reflection, empathy, and a shared recognition of the human cost of error. Emily, unaware of the gravity of her indirect role in prompting this revelation, continued to sit quietly, a living symbol of innocence and recognition. The weight of her observation had not only revealed hidden truths, but had also opened the door for a moment of accountability and human honesty rarely witnessed in such settings. Judge Crawford finally spoke, her voice measured but gentle. "Officer Rourke, the court acknowledges your statement. We will proceed with the necessary proceedings. But the court recognizes the gravity of your admission and the sincerity with which it was made." Her words carried authority, but they also carried acknowledgement, recognition that justice, while procedural, also encompasses the human dimension of remorse, accountability, and recognition. Michael exhaled slowly, letting some of the tension drain from his body. Though the loss of Sarah remained immeasurable, he felt a faint sense of relief. Emily's presence had revealed the truth. Max's history had illuminated context, and Rourke's confession had laid bare the human reality behind the tragic events. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, clarity, acknowledgement, and shared understanding could emerge from unexpected places. As the courtroom began to adjust, murmurs filling the space again, Michael whispered softly to Emily, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You helped us see, baby. You helped everyone see." Emily looked up briefly, her small eyes reflecting a gentle, innocent understanding. She returned her gaze to Max, her touch steady, a small but powerful presence amidst the chaos of human emotion that had just unfolded. And in that room, heavy with grief, recognition, and remorse, a subtle transformation had occurred. The courtroom had witnessed not just legal procedure, but the human heart, fragile, flawed, and capable of immense honesty. Rourke's breakdown was not a moment of weakness, but a turning point, a bridge between loss and acknowledgement, facilitated in part by the intuitive clarity of a child and the silent witness of a loyal dog. It was a moment that would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls, a testament to the enduring power of human truth and recognition. The courtroom had shifted from a place of formal procedure into something almost sacred. After Officer Rourke's emotional confession, every person present felt a tension unlike any before, a mixture of grief, recognition, and a profound awe that made even the most hardened legal professionals pause. The rustle of papers, the quiet tapping of pens, and the distant hum of the courthouse seemed muted, as though the building itself had absorbed the weight of the human drama unfolding within its walls. Emily, still seated on her father's lap, had not moved. Her gaze remained locked on Max, her small fingers tracing the dog's thick coat, gentle and deliberate. She did not understand the legal nuances of the trial, nor did she grasp the implications of Officer Rourke's words, yet her presence had shifted the entire room. She had become the quiet center of gravity, an anchor for the emotional storm that had just passed through the courtroom. Michael Carson, holding his daughter close, felt his chest tighten with a mixture of pride, sorrow, and tentative relief. Emily had acted instinctively, recognizing something no adult had noticed, and in doing so, had illuminated the hidden truth of a tragedy that had haunted him for months. Now, as the courtroom absorbed full weight of Rourke's breakdown, he realized that Emily's small presence had guided the room toward a rare clarity, the recognition of human error, loss, and the fragile beauty of accountability. As spectators, who had arrived expecting testimony, legal argument, and perhaps media spectacle, were now witnesses to something far more profound. Conversations had ceased. The courtroom had fallen into a silence so deep it was almost palpable. Even those who had approached the trial with skepticism could sense the gravity of the moment. Faces were still, eyes wide, and breaths held. It was as if the courtroom itself was collectively exhaling, processing the emotional truth revealed by the combination of childlike intuition, canine loyalty, and human remorse. Max, the retired police dog, remained calm, yet there was an intensity to his presence that commanded attention. He moved slightly closer to Emily, resting his head gently against her lap, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. In that simple act, the room seemed to absorb a sense of balance amid the chaos of human emotion. The child and the dog had become a quiet focal point, a bridge between past tragedy and present understanding. Every observer could sense the depth of connection, the invisible threads linking Emily to Max, and Max to her late mother. The attorneys, witnesses, and even reporters shifted in their seats, realizing that the focus of the courtroom had subtly transformed. What had been a matter of legal argument and evidence had become a human story, a narrative of grief, recognition, and emotional truth that transcended the sterile language of law. Prosecutor Eleanor Pierce leaned toward her colleagues, whispering urgently, This is bigger than evidence. This is recognition. We need to document it carefully." Her words underscored the extraordinary nature of the moment. The courtroom was no longer simply observing procedure, but witnessing life's raw clarity. Judge Helena Crawford, seated with her usual poise, allowed the silence to linger. She understood that this was more than a trial. It was a rare instance where truth, memory, and emotion converged in a way that could not be quantified. Her eyes swept across the room, noting the expressions of awe, grief, and realization on the faces of witnesses, attorneys, and spectators alike. The formalities of law, though essential, had ceded ground to the quiet human drama unfolding before them. A drama anchored by a child, a dog, and the remorseful truth of an officer forced to confront his actions. Rourke's hands, still trembling, gripped the edge of the defense table. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice, but every word he had spoken had already rippled through the room. The silence was not empty. It was full of weight, resonance, and an almost tangible understanding that the courtroom's function had shifted. The emotional truth had surpassed procedural arguments, leaving everyone present suspended between grief and recognition, awe and reflection. Michael glanced down at Emily, marveling at the quiet power of her presence. The small child had done what no amount of testimony could achieve. She had illuminated the bonds and consequences of a life cut short, connecting them to the loyal canine who had once worked alongside her mother. Emily's touch, gentle and instinctive, had reminded the courtroom that human understanding is often guided not by reason alone, but by the unfiltered insight of innocence. Max's calm demeanor seemed to stabilize the heightened emotions in the room. His eyes occasionally flicked toward Rourke, a silent acknowledgement of the officer's recognition and guilt, as if the dog understood the full weight of the confession. There was no aggression, no judgment, only presence, a living testament to loyalty, memory, and trust. In the stillness of the courtroom, it became clear that Max was more than a witness. He was a silent participant in the unfolding reckoning, embodying the connection between past, present, and the fragile continuity of life. Whispers began to ripple through the spectators, though no one dared break the overarching stillness. Conversations were muted, expressions solemn, as they watched the profound, almost sacred interaction between child, dog, and man. Some spectators felt tears prick at their eyes. Others found themselves holding their breath in reverent silence. The trial had begun as a matter of law, but now it had evolved into a human story, impossible to ignore, impossible to analyze purely in terms of rules or procedure. Even the press, usually eager to capture dramatic soundbites, paused. Cameras remained pointed toward the trio, Emily, Michael, and Max, but there was no rush to record commentary. The words that had emerged, the recognition that had been revealed, were far more important than any journalist could frame in a headline. The room understood that this moment transcended reporting. It was a rare intersection of grief, insight, and the undeniable clarity that sometimes emerges from innocence. Judge Crawford cleared her throat, her voice soft but carrying through the courtroom. "Let this moment stand," she said, her tone imbued with gravity. Not merely for the purposes of record, but as recognition that sometimes truth emerges in forms we do not anticipate. Let this courtroom acknowledge the clarity presented before us. Her words, deliberate and reflective, allowed the courtroom to breathe while maintaining the sense of reverence that had descended upon the room. Rourke's posture softened slightly, though the weight of guilt remained evident. He lifted his eyes to Emily, acknowledging her unspoken role in prompting clarity. For a man who had relied on rules, training, and authority, the realization that a child's intuition had illuminated critical truth was humbling in ways he could scarcely describe. He inhaled slowly, letting the stillness of the courtroom settle around him. A silent admission that the formalities of law were sometimes secondary to the simple, unfiltered truth revealed by human connection. Michael whispered softly to Emily, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You've helped everyone see, baby," he murmured. Emily's small fingers tightened briefly around Max's head in response, as if affirming the bond and the significance of her observation. In that quiet exchange, the courtroom absorbed a profound lesson. Clarity, recognition, and truth do not always come from experience, training, or legal expertise. Sometimes they come from innocence, intuition, and the connections that endure beyond life and loss. As the courtroom continued in its reflective silence, the spectators, witnesses, and staff slowly began to understand that this moment had altered the trial irreversibly. The focus had shifted from blame to understanding, from procedure to recognition, from grief to the possibility of reconciliation and insight. Emily, unaware of the profound impact she had had, remained quietly connected to Max, her presence anchoring the emotional currents swirling through the room. In that stillness, the courtroom became more than a legal arena. It became a space of human truth, witnessing, and quiet reconciliation. A fallen mother, the grieving father, the remorseful officer, and the loyal dog were all connected in ways that exceeded legal definitions. It was a tableau of grief, recognition, and the subtle but undeniable power of innocence. A moment destined to remain etched in the memories of everyone present. The room fell into a collective awareness, a shared acknowledgement that life, loss, and the clarity of understanding often arrive in forms no one expects. The trial would continue, and legal procedures would still unfold, but the emotional and moral truth had been revealed. And at the center of it all, quietly, Emily and Max remained, a child and a dog, guiding everyone toward the revelation of connection, memory, and recognition that had eluded the adult world for months. The courtroom felt different that morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood floors and casting long shadows across the rows of benches. The tension that had gripped the room for weeks had eased, replaced with a fragile calm, a sense that the emotional weight of past events had begun to find its proper place. The echoes of Emily's two words, "Mommy's dog," still lingered in everyone's minds, a quiet reminder of the profound insight that had shifted the course of the trial. Michael Carson sat near the front, holding Emily close on his lap. She was unusually calm, her small fingers entwined with Max's thick fur as the retired police dog rested his head against her legs. The child was unaware of the monumental role she had played in unraveling a complicated case. She only knew that Max felt familiar, comforting, and safe. Michael watched her, marveling at the clarity she had brought to their lives and to the courtroom. Her innocence had pierced through grief, guilt, and confusion, illuminating a path toward understanding that no adult had been able to navigate. Officer Rourke sat quietly at the defense table, his usual rigid posture softened by weeks of introspection. The breakdown he had experienced during Part 6 had marked a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone in the courtroom. He had confronted his mistakes, acknowledged the consequences of his actions, and for the first time, allowed the humanity of the situation to penetrate his carefully constructed defenses. Now, as the trial neared its conclusion, there was a subtle tension between relief and anticipation, a collective sense that the story had reached its moral climax. Judge Helena Crawford presided with measured calm, aware that the courtroom had become more than a place of legal procedure. It had transformed into a stage for truth, recognition, and emotional reconciliation. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the expressions of attorneys, witnesses, and spectators alike. Everyone had been affected differently, some with grief, some with remorse, and some with awe at the unexpected clarity brought by a child and a dog. She knew that this case would be remembered, not just for its legal significance, but for the profound human story it had revealed. The final witness called to the stand was a retired handler from the K-9 unit, familiar with Max's service history and his bond with Sarah Carson. He spoke gently, recounting Max's past, emphasizing the loyalty, intelligence, and emotional depth of the dog. Max has always had an extraordinary bond with Sarah Carson, the handler said, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. Even after her retirement, he remembered her commands, her presence, her very essence. And sometimes, that connection is recognized by those who share her bloodline, her daughter. The courtroom fell into a hush as everyone absorbed the significance of the statement. The realization that Emily had recognized Max, and by extension her mother's legacy, resonated deeply. Michael felt a lump form in his throat. The truth of what had been lost, combined with the unexpected guidance Emily had provided, created a complex web of grief and understanding. He looked down at his daughter, gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, and whispered softly, "You've helped us see the truth, baby." Emily's small eyes met his for a moment. A quiet acknowledgement passing between father and daughter, a moment of unspoken understanding. Rourke, witnessing the testimony and the impact of Emily's insight, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He realized that his previous justifications, protocol, split-second decisions, and duty were insufficient to account for the human lives entwined in that night's events. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes as he contemplated the ripple effects of his actions, the loss of Sarah Carson, and the grief he had unintentionally caused her family. For the first time, he experienced a form of emotional closure, understanding that acknowledgement and remorse could coexist with the formal judgment of the law. The judge allowed both the prosecution and defense to make their closing statements. Eleanor Pierce, representing the prosecution, focused on the human costs of the raid, the lapses in communication, and the tragic consequences. Yet she also acknowledged the revelation Emily had provided. This case has shown us the truth is not always contained in reports, schedules, or procedures, Pierce said. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through the eyes of a child, reminding us of our shared humanity. Martin Langley, speaking for the defense, took a different but complementary approach. He emphasized Rourke's years of service, the split-second nature of his decisions, and the courage it took to confront his own guilt. He then highlighted the role of Emily and Max, pointing out the inexplicable, almost miraculous way in which recognition, memory, and innocence had guided the courtroom toward understanding. It is rare, Langley concluded, that a trial reveals not only facts, but profound truths about loyalty, love, and human connection. Today, we have witnessed such a truth. Judge Crawford listened intently, nodding subtly as both statements concluded. She rose, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "This trial has been extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying both authority and warmth. "It has been a legal examination, yes, but also a human one. We have witnessed grief, recognition, remorse, and the unfiltered perception of a child who reminded us all of what truly matters." She paused, allowing her words to settle. This courtroom acknowledges the significance of the connections revealed today between family, between colleagues, and between a child and a loyal companion. The sentence was delivered with procedural precision, yet the emotional undertone carried far beyond the legal verdict. Officer Rourke would face accountability, yes, but the human dimension of the trial had been irrevocably shaped by Emily's insight. Michael felt a measure of peace settle over him. He understood that no legal decision could ever fully restore what had been lost. Yet the recognition of truth, guided by his daughter and Max, offered something invaluable: the possibility of healing, acknowledgement, and human reconciliation. As the courtroom began to disperse, whispers and murmurs filled the room. Spectators exchanged glances. Journalists quietly documented the extraordinary events, and attorneys quietly reflected on the lessons learned. But at the center of it all, Emily and Max remained quietly connected. The dog's head rested gently on her lap, her small hands stroking his fur with the gentleness only a child could convey. In their shared silence, there was understanding, comfort, and the subtle promise of enduring loyalty. Michael watched as people lingered to observe Emily and Max, many moved to tears or quiet reflection. He realized that this moment, their bond, the recognition of Sarah Carson's legacy, and the clarity brought to the trial, had become a symbol of hope amid tragedy. Emily, though unaware of the magnitude of her role, had illuminated a path through grief and guilt, demonstrating that innocence and recognition could guide even the most complicated human processes. Rourke approached cautiously, his expression still heavy with remorse. He knelt slightly to meet Emily's gaze, careful not to impose or frighten. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. I understand now what I didn't see before." Emily looked at him, blinking slowly, her soft touch still on Max's fur. She did not speak, but the silence itself was a response, a bridge of recognition and forgiveness that transcended words. Outside the courtroom, the family paused to collect themselves. Michael held Emily close, Max trotting quietly beside them, and for the first time in months, a measure of peace filled the air. The tragic events that had shaped their lives remained, but the revelations brought clarity, acknowledgement, and the possibility of emotional closure. Emily's innocence, Max's loyalty, and the humanity of those involved had converged to create a rare moment of understanding that would be remembered for years to come. As they walked away from the courthouse, Michael glanced down at Emily, her small hand clutching Max's fur gently. "You've helped us all," he whispered. Emily smiled faintly, as if she understood, though her thoughts were likely far simpler. A warm dog, her father close, and the comfort of a small, safe world. And in that simplicity lay the profound truth of the day, that love, recognition, and innocence often reveal the clearest truths in a world clouded by complexity and grief. The case would continue to be studied, reported, and debated. But the human story, the quiet bond between child and dog, the acknowledgement of mistakes, and the unveiling of hidden connections would remain at the heart of it. Emily and Max had reminded everyone that even in the darkest moments, clarity and understanding could emerge, guided by the simplest and most profound of truths. Love, loyalty, and recognition endure, even in the face of tragedy. And in that realization, healing began.